So, we're in here talking about how to best treat and manage our patients 9 to 99 times out of 100. Probably we're doing that. And I'm reminded by something Barth Green said at faculty meeting last week, which was he was commenting on the epidemic of problems with physician self-care and depression and burnout and all that kind of stuff. And that's why I'm especially excited to have Dr. Youssef speak to us today. I first heard about Fayed when one of our alums, Juan Uribe, which most of you guys know, Juan started telling me about what was going on in Tampa. And we spent many nights talking about this drinking. And he said, Harry Van Leveren, who's the chair there, had brought in a coach, like a life coach, into the department. And as I was thinking about this, like, wow, that's so odd because neurosurgeons wouldn't think of themselves as needing something like that, like a life coach to help them struggle with whatever multitude of challenges we face every day. And Juan told me this interesting story that when Harry Van Leveren was approached with this proposition to have a life coach from the athletics department come in, that his precondition was that the coach take call with the residents for 3 months. So you guys have just gone through this whole thing with Komatar about how many hours you work and all that. I'm like, wow, how would you bring in someone who's never been a neurosurgeon or a doctor to take call in the middle of the night, go see ER consults, manage, angry nurses and anesthesiologists and all that? And Juan's like, no, this happened. This actually went down. And so for many, many months, and I don't know the details of it, I only heard the stories, Fayed was taking call like a resident, like buddy call, as we call it, right? Buddy call. And it just fascinated me. And apparently at the end of this, it proved to be so insightful, his insights, that Harry brought him officially into the Department of Neurosurgery, and where he's been for a number of years now, helping with all manner of issues that we face every day. So I'm super excited because Fayed, and last night we were at dinner talking about this, has been involved in two of my favorite groups of people, neurosurgeons and professional and the highest level collegiate athletes in terms of how to manage their lives and how to be successful and be the best at what you do. So Fayed, we're looking forward to your talk. Thank you for coming all the way from Tampa. Why don't you take the mic?
Thank you. Michael, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to correct one thing, not life coach. I prefer not life coach, but performance coach. But thank you for having me. We had a wonderful dinner last night with some of the fellows. The hospitality has been great, so I'm just delighted to be here today. So yeah, today my talk is titled Winning Championships in Academic Neurosurgery, and I want to go through a little bit about the experience I've had at USF and maybe how it could apply in your lives here. I already know that this is a great program, so hopefully you'll recognize a lot of the stuff that I talk about and go, yep, we do that, we do that. Disclosure is just one, medical memory. I don't know if y'all have that here, but this came out of a relationship through neurosurgery out at the Barrow. So I am on faculty at the University of South Florida. This is my South Florida. It's on the West Coast. We have sunsets, we have flat surf. We have what is affectionately referred to as Champa Bay with our sports teams. Not to be confused with the Miami nightlife, Crockett and Tubbs. So different generation, you probably don't know who they are, but go look up Miami Vice. So why this title? In sports and athletics, if you said, hey, it's the championship, it's the Stanley Cup, it's the World Series, you kind of automatically know what it means to be in the championship. The majors for individual sports and then individual accolades. But neurosurgery, academic neurosurgery, it's a little bit different. It could be an individual status symbol. It could be chairmanship or directorship, or you've achieved full professor. We have our Chiefs here. So going back 2016, I think was your championship in softball. Could be national rankings, which are based on academic productivity, publications, or it could just simply be reputation, what people say about you. As Dr. Wang was saying, I sat down with Harry Van Leveren, my first introduction, and I said, tell me about the program. Who are you? What are you about? And he was very clear. We're the smartest, hardest working people in the hospital. We're leaders here. We're a great team. Everyone in the hospital loves and respects us. And again, remember, this is around 2015, so this made sense back then. He goes, we're the New England Patriots. So I did embed in the program. That was the deal. I went on calls. Because I had zero credibility. I went on calls. I went to conferences. I attended business meetings. I had all my credentials. I had my scrubs. and I lived the life of a resident. And at the end of that experience, I still remember I was in the OR in Scrubs. Van Leveren sees me. He says, "Hey, let's go have a conversation." So we found an empty conference room. And he says, "So you've been here a while. What have you learned?" And I said to him, "Well, you're some of the smartest people I've ever been around. You're some of the hardest working people I've ever been around. You, Harry Van Leveren, you're a leader in the hospital, but your attendings aren't the happiest people. They're not the most respected people, especially by the residents. And the residents aren't as excited and happy to be here as you might think." And I'm just reminded of the Jack Kennedy reference from Senator Lloyd Bentsen. You know, I've been around championship teams, mostly college. This is not a championship team. So this was my message. If you were an NFL team, you aren't winning any Super Bowls right now. In fact, I'm not even sure you'd make the playoffs. Easy to sort of assess as a third party, a little harder to deliver to the chairman of a neurosurgery program. But to Dr. Van Leveren's credit, he looked at me and he said, "Okay, help me make this the program that I always wanted to lead." I said, "Okay, what do you want?" He goes, "I want people to be happy when they come to work. I want them to be excited when they come to work on Monday morning. And when they leave, it's not that they regret leaving, but they're leaving feeling good about having been here. Because I want this to be more of an academic program. I want to improve the teaching, the experience for the residents. Because I get it, I'm the chair of neurosurgery, I'm a leader here, but I want neurosurgery, my faculty, to be leaders at USF and at Tampa General. And for us, at that time, we were two separate entities. So we're working on a marriage now. It was more common law marriage back then, where it's actually turning into a marriage now. And then he said, "I want us to be leaders in the field." So my objectives for the lecture today is to describe this team concept in surgery, neurosurgery, describe the coaching process, what I do, and then describe some of the key qualities of championship programs. And again, I hope you recognize yourself in many of these slides. I suspect you will. So a little bit of background on myself, born and raised in Virginia, first generation American. Did 3 degrees at UVA, undergrad, and then my master's and PhD in sports psychology and leadership. Throughout that time, I worked in athletics at UVA, and then post UVA, trying to build a sports psych practice, just one-on-one with athletes. Worked with all sports, from team sports, baseball, football players, to individual sports. Currently, I've got, it's a discipline called Fit Task. He's the #1 ranked shooter in the world. So not an expert at shooting. I think I've shot a gun once in my life, and that was a pistol. But have been blessed to have people refer me to clients and worked in those different categories. I moved to Tampa, oddly enough, to work in the luxury marine industry. One of my football players, his family built motor yachts, which you see a lot down here in Miami. That was my mini MBA. I got to learn manufacturing. I learned sales and marketing. I did a host of things for the owners. Gelato, one of my former players, a lot of connection. You'll notice through this as former players. He and his brother played professionally in Italy. They were born in Italy, raised there until high school, then played college ball in the US, played in Italy. And when he retired, he calls me up from Europe. And he says, I said, "What are you going to do now?" He goes, "I'm going to start a gelato company." So "What do you know about gelato?" He goes, "I'm Italian." I go, "Well, I'm South Asian. I'm not starting a curry business. So what does that mean?" And it's a great story, because they started, not literally out of the back of their car, but basically out of the back of their car. And they've grown it to a $20 million business now. Sports psychology is getting a little bit more of a reputation these days than it did when I first came out of school. But to give you a glimpse of a little bit of what I do, we were talking at dinner last night, and I thought it was very insightful. Dr. Wang says, to me, the hardest position in sport is field goal kicking. And I went, that's my language. I can talk about field goal. That's my niche, actually. Field goal kickers and punters. So what goes, just show of hands here in the audience, when a field goal kicker comes onto the field, is this isn't really part of football, or do you actually get excited about field goals and extra points? Former don't care, or how many raise your hand if you get excited? Nobody gets excited for the field goal. Thanks to. No, that's kind of typical, right? They're not real football players, but a lot goes into this aspect of the game. Field goal kickers have to understand field position. What hash are they on, the right hash, the left hash? We study the weather the week prior, the turf condition, if you have natural fields versus artificial turfs, what time of year is it? So the turf later in the year is getting beat up where it's really hard, because that affects what cleats you put in your boots. Situations in gold here, because I don't care so much if it's a home game or away game, other than these external elements. We don't talk about game-winning field goals, or, is this a PR? Is this your personal record? Hurry up situations. But those are all the internal factors that are going on in the kicker's head. The other stuff is what people forget is when you have a field goal unit out there, it becomes a game of 11 on 9 versus 11 on 11, right? Because you take the holder out, you take the kicker out, and then you've got 9 guys trying to hold the line and protect this one kicker. So you got 11 guys trying to, take the kicker's leg out. Things out of your control, the snap. Snapping is an incredible thing if you've been up close to it. The really good ones have such speed and accuracy. It's incredible to be able to take a football, throw it between their legs, head down, and get the rotation so that it lands right where the holder wants it. Do you want the laces up, to the side? Where do you want the laces? They can control, a good snapper can control the rotation of the ball while still putting velocity on it. Remember with one of my kickers, they were having trouble with the snap and hold. And it was because the holder's arms were shorter. The new holder's arms were shorter than the last guy. So if you think about it, if your arms are a little bit shorter, the ball's going to rotate a little bit more. So it took hundreds of reps to get the rotation where it could land right where they needed it, because the laces are off. It shouldn't affect a kick, but it can. And then, out of your control, you've got the holder. Does he have the right angle, the right tilt on the ball? Does he have the laces in the right place? All that has to go perfectly well. And then, my guys have to be able to trust the line, trust the snap, trust the hold, have a target in mind, go through their routine, have patience to wait on it, control their speed, which is their approach to the ball, control their tempo, which is their leg swing. And all this happens in about 1.2 seconds from the point of the snap. And when we were talking last night at dinner, I said, this is neurosurgery, right? You've got hours of preparation, you've got many things going on. And then there's that pivotal moment in a case where you've got to go, okay, this is what matters. How do I clip this aneurysm? How do I get this screw in place? How do I make this successful? Not everybody's into sports, I realize that. So part of my dissertation, I spent time with a member of the Dave Matthews Band. Again, probably a different generation here. They're from my hometown. And I was fortunate that I'd get backstage passes. And it is such a great little team community when these guys are on the road. You've got scores of people, the roadies, who can put a stage up in about 90 minutes. That's the lighting, the big screen. So you've got the roadies, they're putting up the video screens, getting instruments into, you've got a sound engineer. They've got to put this whole thing together in incredible time. The band goes out there, they perform, and then they break it down, because once the show's over, that stage comes down, again, 90 minutes, they're on the road to the next show or back to their home camp. So I spent time with the violinist, and it was incredible. His strength, his stamina to be up on the stage for Dave Matthews. They do 3-hour shows in Tampa for whatever crazy reason. They'd come in the end of July. So it's 95 degrees. There's a monsoon outside. They're soaking in sweat before they hit the stage. But they do practice mostly on their own, oddly enough, when before they come out on the road. They'll practice together a very short amount of time, but they practice on their own for the most part. There's great communication on the stage, or they have origins in being a improv band, so that they're able to pass from one point to the next, pass the baton, so to speak. The confidence to get up there and play in front of, I've seen in front of, I think 40,000 is the most. That was in LA. Interesting conversation. I was with some people. We were on the bus for Bruce Hornsby, and he goes, I don't get paid to play music. I go, really? I think you get paid pretty well to play music. He goes, no. I get paid well to be on the road away from my family. When I'm on stage, I'm doing that for free, but I get paid really well to travel and be away. So it's the isolation, the time away, and it's that sacrifice. So everywhere you look, you can find different sorts of teams, even in individual sports. Again, this one center picture is my target shooter, golf, tennis. It's still a team sport. You've got your equipment, you've got people who make your equipment, so you've got your preferred equipment, and then it's customized. I had no idea that the stock on a rifle could be shaped to fit the cheek on your face and your shoulder. But that matters at the highest level. Your golf clubs all fitted. And you've got your support system, your family, you've got your coaches, your sponsors, and then they do have national teams, right? If you're an individual sport or in college, tennis, golf, those are team sports. You play on your own, but your score counts towards the team goal. Corporate work, similarly, there's a lot of teamwork in the manufacturing business, building things up. These three guys are my gelato guys. They're three brothers, two play basketball, one was a tennis player. So my work there, leadership development, organizational structure. We talked a little bit in the car last night. Succession planning. I've worked in family businesses quite a bit. And that's a hot topic, even in neurosurgery fields, right? If you're a chair, Dr. Levy, I guess you're out there, you might be asked by the dean, what's your succession plan? Talent development. That's the role of the faculty here. We've got our residents and our fellows. You're the talent. How do we develop you every single day? But from a faculty standpoint, your directors and your chair, developing the faculty, that's part of my role at USF. In business, customer service, customer relations, those would be your patients, sales, marketing, manufacturing. So I've delved in all that. I've got a little bit of a mini MBA, one of my former bosses told me. So bringing that all together, that's my background. I'm playing golf with a former vice dean of graduate medical education. And he goes, I wonder if there's an application for what you do in your world to what we do in academic medicine, particularly with surgeons. He said, yeah, I'll play the ultimate contact sport. So there are great similarities. We've just been through them. Of course, there's an application. Again, we're going to just kind of go through this a little bit quicker since I've talked about it. But in an athletic metaphor here, the head coach could be your surgeon. Assistant coaches could be if you're a skull-based team, it's working with your ENT partners. I consider the players to be the residents, the fellows, your trainers or your OR team. You've got coordinators, you've got ARNPs and MAs, you've got vendors. And then you've got disease as your main opponent. In the context of competing, there's a lot of preparation that goes into games. If you look at football, it's one game a week on Sundays, Mondays, Thursdays. It's money has driven it to be a full week sport, which is very different because you might have multiple cases this afternoon. And I get that part. It's tougher. But it's still the same process, right? You have scouting reports, which is the clinic visit. If you have spine conference, you go over cases and put together your game plan. The pre-op huddle, this is calling your play. This is what we're going to do today, reminding everybody what their role, their responsibility is. Each play is an operation. You're getting continuous checks, continuous feedback, and then you make adjustments. If the patient declines, what do you do to make sure that they're in the safest position possible? Wins and losses are measured sometimes in life and death in your field. So certainly a little bit more gravitas there. And then instead of talking to the media after a case, you have to go talk to the family. Not sure which is tougher. I've been in those family talks as the buddy, right? When a resident goes and tells a father in the middle of the night that their daughter is not going to make it. I don't know, how do you teach those skill sets and how do you get through those things? But you do. And then the film study after a game is the equivalent of your M&Ms. So the coaching process. get the approval from Dr. Van Loveren. I'm embedded in the program. I do observations, I do interviews. And I try to interview everybody who touches the program. I interview the faculty. I try to interview the residents, the fellows. Interviewing the nurses. We had a talk last night about that. They're team members, right? The ICU nurses, interviewing administrators. You have to understand what's going on in the program from all different levels, all different perspectives, all different touch points. And then you say, does this data match up with what I was told? So if there's a correlation, great. If there's not, that's where you've got to put together the plan. And for me, I put the plan together as much as possible with the stakeholders. Again, I'm still an outsider, even though I spent months on the service. But if I can get the faculty to buy into it, if I can get the residents to buy into the plan because they've contributed to it, then that last phase, the implementation, tends to go a lot more smoothly. And that's the evaluation phase. So I'm looking at character, I'm looking at talent, because those two things put together, that creates the culture. If you have a great culture, your team performance tends to go up. For the most part, I think we have safe practices. I haven't been everywhere the way Dr. Wayne, you know programs all across the country. I've seen a handful. I think for the most part, people function in this middle road. Decent character, citizenship, decent amount of talent, and they're doing a good job taking care of patients. There we go. The problem that you have is when you've got low character and low talent, because then you're a danger to the patients, and it's not a fun place to work. And some of the fellows have been interviewing, and we were talking, and yeah, I was at this place, and wow, the faculty don't, or the partners don't speak to each other. I don't think that's a place I want to spend my career or start my career. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Stay away from those places, but they do exist. Sorry, trying to. All right, let's skip over here. You can have great talent, partners that don't get along. The patients are doing well, they're getting taken care of, but it's not a lot of fun. I would put USF, maybe not that extreme point on the curve, but somewhere in that area when I got there. And there you go. Again, other touch point. And then the last point, this is where I strive in my role. I'm trying to get us with high character, high culture, with great talent, so that it's a high performing group and a happy place to work. So again, this is my implementation phase. There you go. So where do I spend my time? You've got to stay in your lane. It's no different than each of your specialists here at the faculty. They know when a patient comes in, it's something they can do, and they know when to refer to a partner. So for me, coaching, first I triage, I find some low-hanging fruit. I want to get my wins in. What's going to have the greatest long-term impact and I can accomplish in a short amount of time, because you can lose people quickly if you don't have some success. But my coaching is non-technical skills. I work on attitudes, behaviors, leadership, character, and processes. Again, that's sort of the business side, the efficiency, the outcomes, the accountability, the organizational structure, and encourage that transparency. Individual coaching. What are some of the things that people have come to me to discuss, or what have I observed and said, hey, we can talk about this? Pressures and the demands of the job. Communication styles, very important, right? How someone says something, when they say it, their tone. It's not up to the residents, in my opinion, to filter all that. We put that responsibility on the teachers, on the attendings. Know if you're tired, know if you're hungry before you start talking, because that can affect that communication. Why is it important? Why is that your problem? Because the residents are taking care of your patients. Developing trust between teammates. And whether that's nursing staff to physicians or physician to physician. Diversity is an issue now. It's not an expertise, but I can at least point out when there's a lack of it, and then ask what's the game plan. Self-awareness, learning, creativity. One of my favorite sports is golf, and it's not that I have any technical proficiencies, but I love the creativity. There's so many ways to attack a hole, to hit a shot, and I see that in great surgeons. There are multiple ways to get at the point of contact, and the better you know your anatomy, the more options that you have. And then the commitment's important. You're here for 7 years as a resident, 8 years when you're doing a fellowship. So there's a great deal of commitment. How do you sustain that for such a long period of time? Not get cynical, not get burned out, not become jaded by the whole process. And then again, I stay away. I know when I need to pass things off. So technical questions, that's not me. I was another lifetime strength conditioning coach, a little skinnier back then, but I passed that on to other people. Point out to them though, and I've had to do this. I've had people go, "You need to go talk to this person, tell them to go lose weight." It's like, really? That's my job now? It was a chair. I had to go talk to a chair in a program and say, "Time to lose weight." Found him a trainer, nutritionist. Worked for a little while, but didn't sustain. Knowledge of the craft, and then rules and regulation. You have to know that. If you're going to play the game, you've got to know the rules. People ask me, "What's it like working with surgeons versus working with your athletes?" And so I go, you're catering to a variety of personalities, and depending on the moment, the time, the day, their needs, I could be their best friend. You've mentioned Juan Uribe. I consider him a dear friend of mine, a close friend. We talk regularly still. Sometimes you've got to be I'm now at that age where I can be the disciplinarian. I can be the older guy, or a negotiator, a confidant. Sometimes you've got to translate information. Here's what the chair is really saying to you if you're not picking it up. A strategist, here's how to chart your career path. Here's how to get you what you want. So I'm in a circus. I'm working with a lot of different personalities, big personalities. Some of them are lions, some of them are tigers. And in every circus, you've got somebody there in the middle of the ring who has a very important job. That's my job, half the time at least, is chief environmental engineer. I clean up the crap that nobody else wants. That was a joke. Need a little feedback. People at home are laughing. It's okay. And so working with those people, you can coach them one-on-one, you can do whatever you like, but it's got to be continuous and it's got to be intentional. It's very important that these things go on all the time. And that's one reason why Van Leveren gave me a faculty appointment, was I need you here just to hold people accountable, make sure that, and we started with him, by the way, I left that part out. When I gave him the news that they weren't making the playoffs, he goes, "You're going to start with me. You need to make me a better chair." So we would meet every week, formally, one-on-one in his office, and then throughout the week, informally. But what I told him was, we need to document things. If you don't have it documented, then it doesn't count. You can't just say things because you're the chair in the front of an auditorium and expect it to stick. So I would start writing these things down, and it became our playbook. Everything from the culture, what values we'd had, what mission, or what was our mission, communication styles, or compensation. That's the faculty playbook, not necessarily the resident playbook. And then talking about the programs, the processes. And again, I did those in focus groups. I didn't come up with all of this stuff. I had my own ideas, but I vetted it through the residents to make sure that, hey, this is your education program. What do you want to see? How do you want it to be different? If it's not meeting your expectations. And then we went to the faculty, and the program director worked closely with Dr. Valley at the time to make sure it hit all the rules and regulations. And why is this important? I found some of this literature in my own readings about businesses. There's a study, and they compared 440 celebrated CEOs to the second study, just general CEOs. And they did a multi-year follow of their companies. And it was interesting that those with MBAs performed significantly worse. And when they started to dig deep into why is that? Why would an MBA CEO not do as well? A big part is that linear trained logic gets in the way of the touch and the feel of your organization. If you don't have your pulse on how people feel when they come to work, are they happy? Are they satisfied? Are they appreciated? Then the culture suffers. And when the culture suffers, the performance suffers. So that's been our approach at USF is keep your fingers on the pulse of the program at all times. And I hope if you have friends that are residents over there, they would tell you that, yeah, they absolutely have a say in how their program is designed. And we've had instances where they've come to us and complained about chiefs who they felt weren't doing their jobs adequately, weren't taken, because the chiefs run the grand rounds, the education program. They came in on a Friday and said, we're not happy. Friday afternoon, Monday morning, we convened the chiefs with the seniors. By the next Friday, we changed the format of the grand rounds of the education, because it's that important to us. We also make sure that the complaints are valid, but that's what those 4 or 5 days did. We checked. So you've got to constantly talk to your people, find out what's working, encourage more of it, and then find out what's not working. Again, you don't change it on a whim. You've got to back it up with some data. So what are some qualities of a high performance team? I'm going to speed up just so we have time for questions and answers, but common purpose. You've got to have values and missions. You've got to have that single identity, whether it's your scrubs, if you've got jackets that the residents all wear, that commitment. The mission, just so that we're all on the same page, that reflects your purpose as an organization. We spent weeks going over it with our faculty and residents and honed it down. It started out as this very verbose, elegant statement. At the end of the couple of weeks, we finally went, our mission is we make neurosurgeons. It reflects the teachings, the value, the objectives, the priorities. We make neurosurgeons. And there are other parts to that, but that's the mission. It's also something I can remember. And when it's too long, I can't remember it. So that doesn't help. Then we have our values. The values are the pillars of our program. They drive our behaviors and actions. We can hold people accountable to their values if they're not living up to them. And we've had people leave, ask people to leave. Missions like priorities can change over time, but the values should remain constant. We had to delineate, again, this isn't the playbook. What's the hierarchy? Coaches, captains, within the department, define the roles of your chair versus your chiefs, your division directors versus your chiefs. And then understand the language. What are you saying and how are you saying it? Back in sport, I worked with the men's soccer team at USF, and I think we had 18 countries represented, spoke 9 different languages, came up with our value systems one year early in my tenure. We're presenting it to the players, and one of them was hunger. That drive, that desire every single day to go out there and be the best. And we had these 2 kids, great kids from Africa, international players, and they raised their hands and they go, Dr. Yusuf, I don't understand. You feed us before games, you feed us after games. We're never hungry. This is a great program. And like the other, like, okay, there's that language gap. It's a simple one, but everything's got to be understood. You have to be very, very clear. Again, how that communication comes across, the language, the tone, the timing, there's got to be some self-understanding. Am I tired? Am I hungry? Am I thirsty? What do I need to do for myself before I try to communicate something to my partners? That continuous process, self-assessments. In sport, it's incredible. It's important to my players, important to those teams, especially if they're professional, a lot of money at stake. They spend a lot of time on self-assessments, watching film. Your jobs are 1,000 times more important. But how often do you do the M&Ms? How often are you really reviewing your films and your practices? How can I get better? And then the creativity and the innovation, that's a constant. That's the nice thing about academic medicine, right? Is that you have people that are naturally inquisitive. They're doing research. Education, super important in terms of building an academic championship program. How can the conferences be better? How are you planning out the curriculum? What time are the conferences? When are they? Who's leading them? Journal clubs, M&Ms, performance journals. I ask our residents, some of them do it, some of them don't. Make it as easy as possible. I always tell them, in your phone, capture 3 things you did really well in this case, 1 thing you need to improve. You need to be able to go back after every couple of months and go, what are my trends? And if you have something like anatomy keeps popping up as, oh, I didn't understand where to go in this case. Okay, now you know where to go and spend some extra time. Go to the cadaver lab, read up some articles, look at diagrams on the internet, and then mentoring. That's part of the education. There's got to be consistency. There's got to be accessibility. High performance teams, they understand time sensitivity. Remember my first meeting, Tony Dungy, former coach of the Bucks, Indianapolis Colts, nice TV personality. When we were talking about culture, I said, what have you done to start improving the culture with the Bucks? This is way back in the 90s when they were terrible still. Because the first thing I did is I put clocks in all the rooms, digital clocks in all the rooms that are centrally connected. Why would clocks change your culture? He goes, because I need people to show up on time. It's discipline, it's respect. We're going to show up on time. We're going to end on time. You know, we've got play clocks in a game, delay of game penalties. You lose yardage. And I don't want somebody going, hey, you know, my Rolex says it's such and such time. This is before we all carried smartphones. You can compare them. No, there are no excuses. The clock right there says it's 7 a.m. or 7:02. You're late. Here's your $1,000 fine. So things are time sensitive. When do you start cases? When do you finish cases? If you can do a case in 2 hours, we were going through this back at USF. Don't take 4 hours to do a 2-hour case. Residents are not going to be happy. The patients don't want that. Figure it out. If you can't figure it out, we'll help you. I won't help you because, again, that's out of my lane, but we'll find you somebody that can help you. Measuring the outcomes. You got to have those metrics. And then accountability. Always holding yourself accountable. Great organizations. Again, we talked about this great teamwork, trust, communication, building good habits from the moment you step foot. July 1 coming around, the interns, what habits do you want to build in them? Okay. Keys for success with leadership. A vision to see a better future. Yeah, that's your chair. Good chairs, I think, again, talk to their people and ask, what is it that you love about this program? What do we maintain? What is signature about Miami? It's not just the city, but what's in this program where you go, hey, that's a Miami grad. I know that program. Great leaders have the confidence to admit faults. Saying it starts with me. There's a commitment to the process. Changing a culture, it's not a quick fix. It is not, you've got a lot of boats down here. This is those 200-foot yachts that don't necessarily turn in the channel, maybe get tugged out, versus a little 30-foot outboard that can just do 360s and boom, they're gone. So you've got to be committed to the process, and you've got to be an inspiration to those that are following you. The people, it starts with the people. If you don't hire the right people, it can set your program back tremendously. It's hard to fire people in academic medicine, especially at the state level. So once you hire them, spend a lot of time trying to make sure it's the right fit. If they're struggling, get them the help, because it's far better to help that person along for that investment than to just cut them loose. In sport, you just cut them loose. Next day, you fly somebody new in. That's not a big deal. But you've got to address the negative behaviors quickly. And there's zero tolerance if you undermine the locker room, if you undermine the process. A lot of people go, that person, he's so talented, he's great. Yeah, but if he's a cancer in the locker room, is it worth it? Some teams think that they can manage those personalities. You can. It is, my mother, rest her soul, used to say, look, if you have a gallon of milk and you put one drop of blood in there, are you going to drink that gallon of milk? Absolutely not. That's disgusting. It's like, yeah, that's what a bad attitude is. It is spoiling the milk. So you've got to weed that out. And when Dr. Van Loan, we have our saying, we'll look at each other, we get sent into problematic departments where if he's the interim chair, then, you know, I help him run it. We go, we might need a George Washington moment. What's that? That's Valley Forge. The morale is low. Your people are hungry because they're not being paid enough. Their feet are frozen. They're deserting. They're complaining. Every once in a while, you need a good old-fashioned execution. You got to make it the right execution, but you've got to send a message. If you're going to undermine things, this is not the place for you. So this leads me back to the Dave Matthews Band, the violinist. Treated me very well, had great access to things, learned a lot from him, but he had his own personal demons, his own impulses, which were not going to be tolerated by the band, and he got fired. You can forgive him as a friend, wish him well, try to get him help, but you can't keep him in the band if he's not living up to those expectations. And this is a quote from the leader of the band, Dave Matthews. He goes, I'm going to miss having BT over there on my right, but we just can't serve that desire. So from a leadership standpoint, how are you going to protect the core, the culture of the program? So you've got to have that courage to have difficult conversations, to try something different, something new, to even to fail in those efforts and to make yourself vulnerable. Along the ways, be transparent. When we make significant moves, these aren't secretive. There's no conspiring that we're going to do this and do that and surprise people. That'll blow up in your face pretty quickly. So we share the game plan. Chances are somebody has thought about it and gone, hey, what about this or what about that? Or be careful, don't make this error. So we share the expectations, share the rules, and share in the successes. We had a visiting professor from England, and someone he met me and briefly understood what I was doing, and then he's sitting with some other people during the dinner, and he goes, that character is interesting. He goes, you know, he is memento mori. And I go, what does that mean? He goes, you know, in the ancient Roman days, a conquering general comes back to Rome, they throw him a parade. So he's circling the city in his chariot, and they always put a slave in the chariot, just to whisper in his ear, memento mori. Remember that thou art mortal. Remember that you are mortal. All this lavish praise, it's nice, it feels good. At the end of the day, they'll hang you, they'll cut your head off. And so to some degree, that's my other role in this paradigm is, yes, every one of you is an elite performer. You're incredibly smart and talented, but you're also mortal. And if you keep that humility, I think you'll be able to do really, really great things. So final thoughts. I am very grateful to have landed in academic medicine, especially in neurosurgery, because it's the top of the food chart there, right? Because I do consider surgery as the ultimate team sport, because it's got the most valuable outcomes, the most valuable wins. For the greatest success, leaders are in charge of the whole organization. It's a heavy weight. But when you take a group of smart, talented people that are hardworking, they have a shared mission, shared values, everyone gets to enjoy the success. So I found this is a couple of years ago, a photo of, I think, Dr. Levy getting an award for the best paper. So with that, again, I want to thank you for listening. Thank you for having me. The hospitality has been incredible. If we have time, Dr. Wayne, for a few questions, happy to take them.
A lot of our faculty on, I'm sure they have questions or comments, but I'll start things off. So, you know, maybe I've just toyed with this idea and we talk about it all the time in jest, about this idea. You said how hard it is to have people on the right. You said you had to get the right people on the team, and the locker room had to be good. But you also mentioned how hard it is to get people off the team at a public institution or a university, right? Have you guys explored the idea of testing? And I'm not talking about the MCAT, but all these various emotional intelligence tests. People know about Myers-Briggs, Big Five personality tests. Have you guys ever explored that as a way of maybe a screening, or maybe it's just a way to better adapt the program or modify the work schedules of people to better suit that individual person,
Right.
through a concerted testing format? Now, I know you work with them and know them one-on-one, but you know what I'm talking about.
Oh
Right?
yeah, that's a great question. I had a coach who came and asked me about that because they're spending an inordinate amount of time and money recruiting their athletes. He goes, "Is there a way we can test similar? Can we test and can we do this?" And I said, "Oh, you want to know if this person, using a little bit of profanity, this is the jerk off test, we'll call it that one. That's internet friendly, right? They can fake it. They can, to some degree. There's not enough testing out there to know if they're going to fit into your locker room. So it's tough, especially at the medical education level, because you're going to have to take the 300 people that apply, send them all these tests, have the time to get them back, go through those things. I think the Barrow probably, and I don't know what y'all do here, but the Barrow, if I'm not mistaken, they bring candidates in. They've got to spend a couple of days on the service. And then in those 2 or 3 days, they meet and they interview with all of the faculty. I think that's the closest that you can see whether or not that personality is going to fit with you. The Infolds, when the medical students come and spend a month with us, those weigh heavily in our trajectory of whether or not to take somebody. Because in a month, you can fake things for an hour, for a week. If you're there for a month, the residents will figure out whether you've got the work ethic, the personality to fit in with them. So we take those into consideration. The testing, it's a good idea. We have not pursued it. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. Super insightful. My name is Greg. I'm one of the chief residents here. I just had a question because a lot of this is based upon gathering feedback from people. And, I just wonder, how do you separate in a group of people that are by nature tired and overworked? How do you separate like legitimate grievance that should be acted upon from just people basically letting off steam and individual grievances? How do you separate that and begin to understand what needs to actually be acted upon and what's in your eyes legitimate?
Yeah, great question, because it's part of its institutional knowledge. And I see this with other departments when a faculty will come up and start complaining about resources or this or that. That's why I had to spend the amount of time I spent on the service, was to understand the dynamics. So when a resident's complaining about fatigue, about being overworked, then I can go, well, yeah, that's 80-hour residency. Now, if they're complaining about, hey, I'm getting abused, I'm working 100 hours a week, not 80, you need to explore that. Really? How are you getting up to 100? Where's that happening? We have different hospitals. We have 5, 6 different places where our residents either rotate or we're in charge of their spine, of their neurosurgery program. We had that situation. We sent residents up there, and I had a resident ring my doorbell, called me first, said, "Can I come? I need to talk to you." I said, "All right, I'll talk to you next week." He goes, "No, not right now. Can I come to your house?" Rings my doorbell and he goes, "This is what's going on." I was like, wow. So we had to call up the faculty and go, tell me how the experience is with your resident up there. "Oh, it's great. They're doing this, they're doing that. They're so excited." "Yeah. Tell me about that case the other night. What time did that case start?" "Oh yeah, that was tough. They came in, it was an urgent case. Started at 7 p.m. I go, "Yeah. And what time did your residents start the day?" 6. "So what time did they go home?" "Oh, that case didn't end until midnight." "And when did they come back?" 6. "Yeah, you can't do that. That's your responsibility as a faculty. Look at the resident and go, this is a great case. Go home. We'll see you tomorrow. We'll take care of it." So you've got to have that insight. You've got to be able to ask the follow-up questions. I couldn't have done that in the very beginning. I needed the time to understand the rules and regulations, and then the personalities, because there are those politics that are at play when faculty are competing. That guy's getting favoritism. That guy's doing this or that. Oh, okay, so what is this really about? It's about promotion. Is it jealousy? It's spending time with them. Go ahead. Yeah, I don't affect promotions. I don't affect salary. I don't touch on any of those. You know, they know that I have some influence, but I don't really have power.
Dr. Yusuf, hi, Timur Yurkov here, one of the faculty. Thank you so much for sharing the insights. So now you've been at USF for close to a decade, right?
6 years,
6 years.
7 years.
So I'm
First
sure
faculty since 2017. And
so
then
you're
previous-
probably kind of in the routine now, you know what to look for and how to respond and where to go. How is your job performance measured? Like by the end of the year, Dr. Van Laveren is saying there, you know what, we're going to give you another year. What is he basing that?
Yeah, no, great. The person who asked that question isn't Van Laveren because he kind of knows what I am able to contribute. That question comes from the dean's office. That's probably a whole nother talk. My job has evolved from neurosurgery to just working with the neurosurgery department. We had some great success. The hospital was really happy. We had one of the highest turnover rates in the neuro ICU with nurses. So one of my tasks, and that was because of resident interactions with the nursing staff. We implemented some programs, got that number from the mid 20s, high 20s down to the standard hospital, low teens, right around 10%. So then they said, we want to buy some time. When they brought me on faculty, it was, okay, the dean's going to kick in a little bit of my salary. Well, exactly what you said. How do we measure his performance? A lot of it's those metrics, retention, the surveys, workplace satisfaction, but then it's also performance. Is this group performing at a higher level? Are we producing better paper, higher quality papers? Will our faculty start getting recognized? A lot of it's that culture piece, though. Are they better citizens? Are they better people? They're actually, and they're starting to shift me over into the dean's office. I'm kind of, it's supposed to be a compliment, but they're pulling me away from neurosurgery a little bit more. So it's a little painful.
Can I ask you a super practical question? Probably the most common thing you run into in every department is this for the house staff, is this conflict between the house staff and someone inside the hospital, like a nurse, an anesthesiologist, or something like that, right? Because it's just bred for conflict. Because by and large, the pattern is the resident wants to get something done for the betterment of either the service, the attendings, or the patient, right? So they feel very empowered to do it, and they're doing the right thing, and that's part of their job.
Yeah.
And they run into a conflict because the person on the other side obviously is a barrier to that goal being complete, right? Everybody's been in this situation, right? And it happens again and again and again. You must have this as your number one to-do list item every morning, right? How do you, and I know every case is different, how do you typically approach that's such a common thing, right? How do you typically approach that?
It is very common. And for us, and I don't know your situation, again, Tampa General owns the house, right? They're the bricks and the mortar of our OR, our hospital beds. And then we are the department, we're the people. But the nursing staff works for the hospital. They know it, we know it. So it's very easy for them to just go, hey, I'm going to write you up, send it up. What we had to address is, number one, don't get into a battle of, I'm doing this for the patient. You know, it's not a good card to play. It's not a good hand to play. It is assume that the nurses wants what's best for the patient as well. You just have different ways of getting there. So assume the best in the other person, and then figure out what is that barrier? What is that conflict? Is it the communication style, how you spoke to that person, or is it more on the practicing side? You've got a senior nurse and a PGY2, and PGY2 says, hey, I want to do this. The nurse is going, hey, that might not be the best idea. You know, Dr. Wang prefers, because the nurse knows you, has known you for the last 10 years. Dr. Wang typically takes care of patients this way. What we had to do is take a step back and go, let's build the relationships. You know, if you're having this kind of conflict, and this is at that faculty / resident physician, to nurse level. Let's not escalate it to the hospital. Because if you get escalated to the hospital level, senior administration, I've been in those meetings, they're going to take the nurse's side. They're going to assume that, you know, your resident's out of line, it was disrespectful, fix it. So we created programs just to build those connections. We talked about this last night, I think, was the joint journal clubs. It's hospital sponsored. We'd had 70 people, so about 30 on our side, 40 nurses came to the first one. Resident had to co-present the article with the nurse. They had to get up there, just like I'm standing here. They had a plan, coordinate, communicate. And it was a chance for the nurse to give her perspective on a patient situation. The resident goes, well, this is why we do what we do. Probably the most important thing we did was, and this was, Van Lovren said, if I'm coming to this dinner, there better be an open bar. So we had an open bar, we had decent food, but it got everybody to recognize them not just as my obstruction to being a doctor. It was, hey, this is a mom, this is a sister. The women nurses went out of their way to dress up. So, wow, this is an attractive woman. So we had to start recognizing them as human beings on the other side. And the same thing from them was, oh, these are nice people. They're, you know, they are here working hard. They are funny. They do have personalities. So that's what's helped us. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, it does. Certainly that takes the friction off of the doctor and the house staff and the other relationship. But what if it's actual patient care? So that works very well in a setting where there isn't something at stake, but there is, for real, there is an incentive malalignment. So when, let's say, anesthesia, right, works on a shift, there is no incentive at all, zero incentive for them to finish a case or start another case. This is just a fact. That's the alignment, right? Whereas for us, we finish the case and then we go home. So that fundamental issue, if you were to say, like you said, that the house owns the rules, right? So basically the nurses are always going to be right? And surgeons don't write people up. That's the other thing. Surgeons, I've never heard of a surgeon writing someone up in the history of my career. And I've known a lot of people because we don't take the time to do it. It's not in our culture, right? But anesthesiologists and physiatrists and nurses and physical therapists, they'll write people up because it's in their culture. So there are a lot of bad apples on that side as well, right? And it's not all guiltless that people are obstructing because they want to obstruct. There's no incentive for them to do the next thing. So you must have some corollary on the other side of that house that manages that piece, because there are bad apples. We just saw a nurse at very, very hot topic, the nurse at Vanderbilt that's going to jail.
Yeah.
Right. This is the hot topic, right? Because this has never happened in America. But there are a lot of people who are saying, yeah, of course, you need to make an example of people who don't take any responsibility for giving the wrong medication and killing a patient in an MRI scanner, right? In the past, it was always just, well, there's no fault, right? We're just going to pay it off. Now someone's going to jail. So I think there's the personal side, which is how we feel about each other, which matters a lot. But then what about when one of our residents is trying to get a patient to CT and the fact that CT got delayed because you like the nurse? I'm not going to yell at her and she's not going to yell at me, but then the patient just died. So in that little graph you showed about the competence and then the character, right?
Right.
The talent and character. There are some people who are very skillful at managing this, but there are real barriers. Do you have someone on the nursing side who is like, okay, this is your bad apple, and they say, I trust you because we have a good relationship, that person's getting fired? For example, I'm just,
Yeah, and that's building up those relationships, right? So on the nursing side, the nurse manager, we're lucky that we have two good nurse managers. And when you have that conflict, this goes back to your chief's question. Was this the fault of that nurse for slowing it down, for missing it? We have a good enough relationship. You've got to invest in those relationships. It's self-serving. On the one hand, yeah, you want them to have a good experience, to be happy when they come to work. But at the end of the day, it's the happier they are, the more that they'll do for us. So you invest your time and resources into building the relationships so that you don't have to yell. But when you do need to yell, it's not taken personally. It becomes, oh, wow, this is that serious. I need to get this done. So we have certain faculty that can yell quickly. After a while, it's just, oh, that's Joe yelling. It's like if I yell at my kid, he just starts to laugh.
Dr. Yusuf, thank you for that very inspirational talk. I think what Dr. Wang touches on is the idea of empowerment of employees vertically, from the janitor all the way to the CEO of the company. How do you empower employee to go over and beyond to take care of patients? So I guess, as a neurosurgery, in the neurosurgery faculty, we're type A's, we're all highly motivated. So what is your advice for if there's a trainee or a faculty member that's falling behind in terms of whatever objectives they have or goals?
Mhm.
How do you try to empower that individual to go over and beyond, instead of stopping them on the wrist, but how do you empower them? How do you empower a division or a department?
Yeah, I think it starts from day one. It's that culture that you get to know them. One of our mentoring programs, GME's got their own rules and regulations, and these days it's kind of crazy. They want you within your second year to find a mentor. How do you know who your mentor is going to be? You've been an intern, you haven't met all the faculty. Our mentoring program is slightly different. I think we have to call it something different just because mentoring means what it means in GME language. I took our faculty, knowing what their quirks, personalities were, said every 6 months, you two are getting an intern and then swapping. You two faculty are getting the PGY 2s, 3s, 4s. And then Valerie and I take the 6s. The chiefs should have mentors by that point, obviously, but we also spend time with them. The rule is you take them out to dinner in your 6 months, at least once, take their partners, there's, whoever that may be, their family. If it's too big and you don't want to take them to a nice dinner, expensive dinner, then bring them to your house. The mentoring program is not, it's funny because I had a couple of faculty that goes, thank you. I finally get a resident to help me with my papers. I go, no. There's no paper writing. There's no projects here. The mentoring is get to know your resident. We had a case where a resident's wife was going through cancer. So he's going home taking care, he was working full day, going home taking care of a sick wife. How are you going to be at your best if you are doctoring 24 hours around the clock and you've got a dying spouse? Another resident similar, but it was the mom who was diagnosed with cancer. It's part of it's none of my business, but the other part is, hey, if we're going to be a family, if we're a team, then I need to know these little details. What could be taken away from that person's ability to be at their best? Typically, every once in a while you get every once in a while you get somebody who just doesn't fit, and we've had to let some residents go. But otherwise, it's get in there early, be there fast, and get them the help that they need. If it's technical help, here's where we've got a lab. If it's culture fit, they spend time with me.
So in your opinion, sometimes I feel like some mentorship programs they feel forced because I'm assigning you with you and we're going to go for dinner. And then those mentorships never last very long because it's forced. It doesn't happen organically.
Yeah.
What is your suggestion? Do you feel
So
like it should be organic,
those aren't
or-
supposed to last. The way that I do that mentoring program, it is to expose you to the different faculties so that you can figure out who really who's going to fit with your personality and your interests. So, some guys come in at PGY2 and they know I'm going to be a spine. I'm here for Dr. Wang. That's great. But we've had others that slowly over time go, wow, I kind of like the cranial side. Maybe I should spend more time there, or vice versa. So yeah, I agree. Those need to happen organically, but we have to mentor them both on being adults, being grown-ups, being responsible. Some of our residents have never had a job. College, med school, residency. They don't know how to be a grown-up.
Thank you very much, Wyatt.
All right. Thank you for having me, everybody.
He wants to meet with you
Sure.
in the next hour, so have him here. He's going to come up later.
Okay, good morning. I see a lot of laser aficionados in the audience. Dan, thank you for coming. So I'm doing this talk because we recently got our long-term data published in epilepsy. So I thought I'd just go back through a lot of the literature that we actually produced a lot here about lit therapy for epilepsy. A lot of that work was done before I was kind of around, but we'll go through all of it and and also the long-term data, which we have now out to really 6 years for mesotemporal epilepsy. So epilepsy is very common. More than 68 million people in the world are diagnosed with epilepsy, the majority of which are mesotemporal lobe epilepsy. If you count them all as a group, it's about a third of it. And then 30% of all epilepsy cases are what's considered medically refractory. So they failed a trial of 2 or more anti-epileptic drugs. So a lot of these patients have had a neurologist for years. They've trialed multiple drugs, failed them all. They're having tons of seizures. I mean, multiple seizures per day. So they're quite miserable. And then of the mesotemporal lobe cases, which is really what I'm focusing on here, about 70% of them. So most of them have evidence of sclerosis in the hippocampus and the mesial structures. So here's just some visual examples of this. This is some sclerosis here. You see on the MRI scan, you see the difference between the left and the right. And then here's the typical workup for a case like this. You've got the sclerosis seen on the MRI scan. And then you have an interictal PET, which shows decreased uptake, and then the ictal SPECT, which shows increased uptake. And they have typical seizure patterns, which are lip smacking. They have oral and gustatory sensations, things like that. And sometimes they can become generalized and have full tonic-clonic seizures as well. This is just more of a primer because I'm going to talk about some of these things before, and I don't know if some of the junior residents are totally familiar with this, but there's a classification scheme for epilepsy patients, which relates to their almost more like their quality of life. It's the Angle classification. It's 1 through 4. Angle 1 is really free of any disabling seizures. People can still have auras, but nothing, no true seizures. Angle 2 is essentially seizure free, but they have very rare disabling seizures. So they can have focal seizures or tingling or auras, but nothing disabling. And then Angle 3 is where you have some worthwhile improvement of your in seizure reduction, but they're still having disabling seizures. And then Angle 4 obviously is no improvement. Surgical treatments for temporal epilepsy really date back to the 50s with Wilder Penfield, when he was really the first to describe the anterior temporal lobectomy and resection of the mesial structures. This is the paper actually from 52, where he described it. Here's some of his drawings, which are kind of have a 1950s flair to them. That kind of large operation got refined over the next several decades, where they tried to be more selective because they had realized that the seizures were coming from the mesial structures, and were trying to avoid taking out the neocortical structures on the surface, which are really where, especially in the dominant temporal lobe, where language is mapped. So they tried transcortical resections in the 80s. Yazergill tried to do transsylvian resections, but they were still running into the same problems, which they were having issues with the neocortical function, because regardless of what their approach was, they were still getting some level of injury. In 2001, this study was produced. It's pretty famous. It was published in the New England Journal, and it's a randomized controlled trial of medical management versus anterior temporal lobectomy. Here you can see what they were resecting. Obviously, in the dominant lobe, they're resecting less than the non-dominant lobe, and there's a fairly robust and worthwhile reduction in the seizures in this series. You can see a huge difference between these the surgical group and the medical group, and this is like truly disabling seizures in focal patients with seizures with impairing awareness. So it's quite a meaningful difference between those two. Here's another study, again, kind of demonstrating the importance of surgical treatment for temporal epilepsy. A little bit smaller, but again, same thing, randomized trial from medications versus surgical therapy. Medical group no patient was seizure free. In the surgical group, about 73% rate of seizure freedom. And you can see here in their raw data table here, this is essentially a seizure diary. On the bottom here, you have the patients who are treated surgically. On the top, you have patients who are treated medically. And you can see all the recordings here. All this blank stuff is just zeros from all these patients who've been essentially cured. Both these trials, the only kind of unfortunate thing or fortunate thing is that there's a lot of crossover because a lot of patients were getting treated medically and very quickly wanted to go to surgical treatment. So that's one of the downsides of both these studies. But anterior temporal lobectomy has issues. Some of them are just your typical surgical issues, just from doing a larger surgery. You're resecting a lot of tissue. You have a much larger wound, large craniotomy, and then there's procedure risks. Dominant temporal lobe, you're going to have language function, you have amnesia issues, neuropsychological changes, visual changes. And then because of the scale of the surgery, you're ending up with a larger hospital stay, more morbidity, things like that. So then people started searching for other things, and then that thing kind of became laser interstitial therapy. It's really for non-lesional mesial temporal lobe epilepsy, and I'm not talking about hippocampal sclerosis. Obviously, if somebody has a tumor like a ganglioma or oligodendroglioma, that's something that gets resected. It's not something that gets treated with laser therapy. It's curative with surgery. So there's no reason to do lit in those patients. It's just by definition minimally invasive, if you want to call it that. People are still getting intubated, but the size of the drill hole that's made is a little bit bigger than a pencil, and there's no effect on the neocortex. Theoretically, these patients usually discharge the next day after just an overnight ICU stay, more for observation than anything else, and they do very well. One single stitch is really all they need. Laser therapy kind of goes back to the 60s, where people were using handheld lasers. It was sort of a fad. Then lit came kind of to become useful in the 80s when it was being used on tumors at first, but they were just sort of sticking it in tumors, and there wasn't really a lot of science or data to it when they were trying to essentially ablate tumors bluntly. There was no guidance at all. In the 90s, they developed guided ablations, but they were more like kind of cover up your eyes and throw the dart and then look kind of things. I guess is the best descriptor of them. They would get post ablation MRI scans, and that was because they didn't have real time ways of looking at the ablation as it was happening, and so they couldn't really guide the therapy. And then in the 90s is when they first developed thermometry, and we'll go over the TDE maps in a second. But at that point, it was kind of lost favor, and it really wasn't until 2012 when the first interstitial therapy was done with mesial temporal lobe epilepsy. And the goals of lit are a little different, obviously, than surgical treatment, because surgical treatment, just cut things out. It's very clear. There's very clear goalposts to go back to your talk, but it's more difficult because you're using a laser, and so your goal is to get sharp demarcation the same way you would do with removing tissue, and you also want to maximize the amount of light tissue ablated with light penetration, because as I'll talk about the next slide, there are some limitations to that, and that has to do a lot with charring. And not to make a gross food reference, but if you've ever seared a steak or something like that, and you just leave it on, you sear it, the inside of it will not cook, right? I mean, that's kind of the commonsensical way of looking at this. So you need to maximize the heating in such a way that you don't cause searing or charring around the heat source. And this was described by the group at Emory, sort of the temperature ranges at which point the tissue needs to be ablated in order to get the effect you want. So really around 43, you're not really getting the kind of effects you need. 44 to 59 is where you get is kind of the sweet range for a lit, and more close to the 50s, where you'll get, the longer you leave laser on, the more ablation you'll get. Once you get above that is where you start to get the instantaneous melting of tissues, and it is kind of uncontrollable. And then above 100, obviously, we're not gonna go there. Here's our typical workflow for those of the people in the audience who haven't been in the room yet, and there's juniors here. We're using the ROSA robot here. Typically, this can be done with a stereotactic head frame. That's how it's been done in the past. That was a little bit before my time. But obviously, this isn't how we don't come from the front of the head like this, but this is from the industry. And patients fixed in the head frame, they're under general anesthesia. We use the robot and merge it with our preoperative planning films, drill a very small hole with an electric drill, and we place a bolted, essentially a bolted catheter, which is this part, through which the laser fiber gets inserted, which is kind of just barely sticking out the tip right here. In our institution, we don't have IMRI, so we have to physically go to the scanner. In some operating rooms, I don't know if USF is like this, where they have an intraoperative MRI scan, but our MRI scanner is essentially across the hall, so it's almost an IMRI. We just kind of wheel our way across the hall. But this is the typical setup for one of these patients. This is a picture given to me by another resident for a tumor, but showing the two of the laser fibers. And what you see here is the actual fiber, which is this blue catheter going through the guidance tube and then into the bolt. And then it's got these two tubes coming off here. This is a water cooling system to prevent charring. So you've got an in and an out, which goes all the way out the room to this pump unit that keeps water circulating and control the temperature. So patients intubated in the MRI scan, the anesthesia is there. And then this is what we're looking at, the damage map or the TDE map. This is what it looks like. So this is a real-time MRI that's occurring. The scanner is continuously running as we're ablating. This is more of a completed ablation, so you can sort of see. This is the raw images. This is the TDE map, and then this is a merged image where you can sort of see the yellow overlaying. But it gives you an idea about where you're actually ablating. The initial maneuver is to give a 30% power dose just to confirm your laser fiber position. You can see it on the scanner, but sometimes the ablation isn't kind of giving the conformation that you want when you give the dose. So we give a 30% dose at first just to make sure everything's appropriate. And then we'll do our therapeutic doses, which are about 65 to 85% power. And usually it's about 3 to 5 runs. Because of the way the hippocampus is shaped, and I'll go over this in a second, but you can't, it's not like a snake where you can just kind of target whatever you want. It's a straight fiber. So you have really 2 maneuvers. You can just turn it on for longer and make the plume of the ablation larger, or you can extrude the catheter and make it more of a cylindrical shape, which is what's been done here, which what looks like essentially 3 runs. And we just do that by loosening up the bolt and slowly withdrawing the catheter as we're doing ablations. Here's just a review of the limbic system, hippocampal anatomy. So here are the important structures: the amygdala, the perihippocampal gyrus, and hippocampus proper. Very medial here, you can see again, it's almost a cylindrical shape, but with a slight curve like a banana. And here on this pathological specimen, you can really see that curvature. Above that, though, is the temporal horn of the ventricle, which I'll discuss in a minute, is somewhat important for the targeting principles that we've described here at UM, actually. So, like I've been talking about, you're kind of targeting something that's not round. It's long and it's curved. And on top of that, you're dealing with issues like where the blood vessels are through this. And so when we run these scans, we're able to see the cortical blood vessels. And so it might just seem easy. Oh, you just send the catheter down the barrel of the hippocampus, but you have to make adjustments for where the blood vessels are, where the choroid plexus is, et cetera. And that kind of limits sometimes where you're able to put the catheter. You're also inferior to ventricle, which is something you try not to transgress. Occasionally we do, but it's ideally not something we like to get to. And then you have to weigh whether you want to ablate the mesial structures versus the tail of the hippocampus. You can take a more lateral trajectory like this and get a better long axis approach to the hippocampus, but you will miss some of these mesial structures that are here that I've kind of given a rudimentary shape over. This is a study that was done, and I'll go over it in a second, but it sort of shows you in green where patients achieved seizure freedom versus where patients did not achieve seizure freedom. So ideally, we want to ablate these mesial structures. And here you see where this is a heat map where which is kind of a misnomer, but this is a multi-center trial that we were involved in with 175 patients included. And you can see where the majority of patients got their seizure freedom was from this red area, and then going down from there, how many patients got seizure freedom based on mathematical averages from all the scans that were sent in. And that's this study, Wu et al., not Eva Wu. It's a different Wu. Again, very good seizure results. We had 58%, or they had 58% angle 1 outcomes, and even at 2 years, it was still very robust at 57%. Low rate of hemorrhage. We have a pretty low rate of hemorrhage as well. Usually, it is radiographic and not clinically relevant. And then they all, of course, had the typical postoperative issues of visual disturbances and psychiatric issues, which we'll talk about later. And this study really showed on a multi-center basis with a large number of patients that really the mesial structures are the key to this. It's not the hippocampal ablation, it's the mesial hippocampus and the amygdala ablation that really is the key to getting seizure freedom. Trying to get the maximum amount of tissue by having a better long axis approach on the hippocampus is not as successful. But that was all built on research that was done here, actually, by some people you'll recognize the names of. Walter, Samir's on this paper. I think Ian was on here somewhere. And what they did was they had 23 of our patients from our series. They did blinded manual tracings on 1 millimeter cuts. So somebody, I forget who, I think it was Ian actually did it. They went in and they just drew the hippocampus and the mesial structures out on every single slice. And they did volumetric analysis of those cuts versus people's seizure freedom. And you can see some examples here of that have been rendered in a 3D program of where the ablations were that were more successful with angle 1 outcomes and those that were angle 4 outcomes. And you can see that these are much more lateral approaches. So these mesial structures were really the key to this. And this might seem very commonsensical and obvious, but it really hadn't been proven at this point. That with this kind of robust data collection, that this was actually the case. And here's going back to that prior study by Wu, that you can see that same thing was found. I mean, you really want to stay in the mesial structures as much as you can, rather than trying to stay in the tail and trying to get as much hippocampal volume as you can. Again, more data that we developed here was, how much does the ablation map, the TDE map, match what you're doing? Because that was a problem in the 80s, was you don't really know what you're doing. You're closing your eyes and throwing, and you don't really know what you're doing until it's too late. So how much does the TDE map actually match up with what you think you're doing? And they compared the immediate post-ablation MRI, which we always do on every patient, to a 6-month delayed MRI scan with the damage map that was done in the MRI suite. And you can see some visual representations of this. The immediate ablations are actually a little bit larger than the delayed ablations, which you might expect. The tissue at the center of the ablations obviously gets much hotter than at the edges. And the immediate ablation is obviously larger than the TDE maps. There's some level of penumbra, you might say, with the ablations. And that was also well described here by the same technology and programming that was done by Ian and Walter to really describe all the stuff that hadn't really been looked at before. The kind of interesting thing about this study, which again, people always suspected, but there was no true quantitative data about, was that the CSF spaces, especially the ventricle, the choroid plexus, these sorts of fluid-filled spaces, and how much of a heat sink they are for the heat that's developed by the laser. And they were able to show on the TDE maps, based on the discrepancy between the delayed cavity and the TDE map, that these were associated with the CSF spaces and the high T2 signals on the scans, kind of confirming everybody's long-held anecdotal suspicion that this was the case. And obviously also found that the mesial structures were required a little more laser energy in order to blade them just based on their size. If we went back to the pathology slide, you'd see that there's kind of the amygdala is almost like a bulbous structure that requires a little bit more power to ablate. Sure, this one here, yeah. But regardless of all this, I mean, the big problem with lit that people will say is there's still the visual changes, the visual deficits that people have, and a third of those are homonymous hemianopsia, a third of them are quadrantinopsia, and a third are cranial nerve palsy. And again, that was something that we kind of we found here, we described here, all mathematically, I mean, stuff that I can't even imagine doing. Walter and these guys, this guy Wu here, and there's another guy here, Pierre DeHaas, who's a physicist, developed this program that they could simulate the ablations that were done based on the TDE map and the postoperative MRI scans, and then run simulations based on if you move the catheter this way, that way, would these things affect the visual pathways in the ways that I just described. And they were able, these programs could run these algorithms 1,000 times and come up with averages. And so that's what this study is kind of demonstrating. So this is a multi-center study with a lot of the patients that we described already. 6.7% had visual deficits. The contralateral homonymous hemianopsia is really an injury to the laterogeniculate ganglion. Sorry. So I drawn on the picture here, the hippocampus mesial structure is kind of in a very rudimentary way. And if you take a path a lot like that, you start to look at, oh, maybe that's the reason for why it's happening. Here's the LGN right here. You're taking that fiber path right through. If you're trying to get to the mesial structures, you're right next to that. And one of the things they found quickly was that in these cases that there's frequently younger patients who had a smaller amount of CSF space, so larger brain, fuller brain that you would expect with a younger brain. And so that there wasn't as much of a heat sink, so they were giving the same amount of energy and they were essentially frying the LGN. So the first thought would be, oh, let me move this catheter laterally, like I've drawn with the yellow arrow, but you don't want to do that because you're not going to get the ablation of the mesial structures, and then you're essentially going to miss out on a seizure freedom, especially in a younger person, which is somewhat important. So that then will prompt you to bring your fiber, and this is the coronal view here, and you can see that the fiber tract here in the hippocampus. You would rather bring that down rather than move it laterally. So here's the LGN it's sort of back in space from where we are here, but you want to move that away in the inferiorly rather than laterally, so you can get better seizure freedom. And again, that was kind of described here. Again, it might seem very commonsensical the way I'm pointing it out, but all of that was really figured out here at Here's another one of the complications that I mentioned, the superior quadrantinopsia, same paper. They also figured this out, which is most likely spread of the optic radiations. This has more to do with the lateral trajectory. This one's a little more self-explanatory. Obviously, I've drawn kind of just a arrow here, but if you move that laterally, you'll see that it'll more likely impact some of these Myers loop fibers. Cranial nerve 4 palsy is pretty common either in open or lit approaches. Kind of self-explanatory also. A more mesial trajectory was associated with this. You can see cranial nerve 4 runs right along the mesial structures. It's very small. It has a long course that runs right along the hippocampus. And that brings us to our kind of long-term data that just got published actually this year, that I was more involved with. This had 48 of our patients for the last 6 years. We had 50 months of mean follow-up, and we looked at two things: seizure freedom rate and psychiatric follow-up as well. Dr. Canner, who's sort of the head of the epilepsy division, is dual trained as a psychiatrist. Also, he has some interest in psychiatric outcomes more than your average neurologist, I think. And we had a 60% rate of Angle 1 outcomes out to 6 years, which is pretty robust, because a lot of these papers are 1 year out, 2 years out. And notably, 83% of the patients were seizure-free during the last year of follow-up. And you're probably asking, why is that? A lot of these patients, during the first couple of years, they feel great, they stop taking their meds, and then they have a seizure. And so then they fall into these other classification schema. But then they kind of get back on the horse, they start taking their meds, and then we get an increase again in the rate of seizure freedom. And then this paper described the long-term predictors of seizure freedom, and those were mesial temporal sclerosis. Those patients obviously had a much better outcome. Patients who had focal to bilateral tonic-clonic seizures had a much better outcome. And then this is a kind of a notable point from this paper, is that there's absence of psychiatric symptoms at the final visit was another predictor of seizure freedom. And you can see here that this is the difference between the mesial temporal sclerosis patients and the non-MTS patients, huge difference in the seizure freedom. But here's the psychiatric outcomes, same thing, much lower rate of seizure freedom with active psychiatric issues. And that could be anything, that could be mood disorders, anxiety, or both. But a lot of patients in the epilepsy population already come with these things as a standard option, so it's hard to fight that. Unfortunately, this does cause some exacerbation of symptoms, which we described in this paper, a lot of which was attributed to the steroid taper, which in the early cases was 7 days, and eventually we reduced it to 3 days. And really only about 6.25% developed a new mood disorder that they didn't have a prior history of, and two out of the 3 of these were improved with treatment. The good news, though, is that we had 62% of them experienced remission of the psychiatric disorder with the treatment, which is much higher than the typical anterior temporal lobectomy case, which is on the order of 50%. And again, 82% of these achieved angle 1 outcomes. So how do you choose? I mean, what I've kind of made it sound really good, but temporal lobectomy has all this data about it. So how's the seizure freedom? And it's really pretty comparable. You have to weigh the morbidity of the surgery and what you're trying to accomplish, whether someone's even willing to undergo a large surgery like that. What are their psychiatric symptoms? But there's a kind of a big asterisk with lit that is kind of hidden, and that's that a lot of the ATL patients are able to get off of AEDs, and that is not the case with the lit patients. Every single one of them is still on one AED. About a third of the patients in the temporal lobectomy cases in the papers are able to get off of AEDs completely. So that is a big difference. And like I said, we have a lot of failures with people who, lose angle 1 outcome purely because they stop their AEDs on their own without the neurologist's advice. So that is a little caveat to everything I'm saying. And how about the psychiatric outcomes? We have a higher rate of mood and anxiety disorder remission, much higher in lit, 62% versus 50%. Again, this hasn't really been evaluated head to head. It's really just kind of anecdotal comparisons. But in large ATL trials, it's about 50%. And Dr. Kanner, like I mentioned, has this kind of interest in psychiatric outcomes, and he's been showing that the mood and anxiety disorder severity is a big quality of life impactor, especially in epilepsy patients. Yeah, I think what happens is that when they see these people in the clinic, just the suggestion of doing such a large surgery kind of dissuades them. That's my kind of suspicion, is that there is some systematic selection of these certain people who are more anxious or are probably more likely to improve a little bit with treatment with lit, because they are so anxious that they don't want to do a huge surgery or whatever. That's just that, but I don't have any evidence of that. It's just yes, true. That is true. That's another good point. Yeah, it's kind of a hard thing to kind of tease apart, because it's so intertwined, and with the kind of nebulous functions of the limbic system, it's hard to tell what's doing what. Is it the surgery? Is it the continued medications, or what? The other bad thing about lit that I have to point out is that we had a much higher rate of anxiety disorder provocation with lit. Usually can be around 15 to 37%, but with us it's closer to 50%. And unfortunately, that's just one of the downsides. And then lit also has some much narrower indications. Obviously, we can't treat lesional cases other than the sclerosis cases, if you want to call them that. The buy-in from the hospital with the equipment is a little bit more extensive. You need to be able to get in the MRI suite on a timely basis. And then on the patient side, the AEDs are a big issue, like I showed. But on the good side, I think lit is a pretty safe and effective treatment for the right patient. It's definitely less morbid. The complications are similar. So am I doing here? And we've shown here that it can improve psychiatric outcomes, which I think is a big plus, especially in this patient group. And a lot of the stuff was done here, which I don't think people realize. I didn't realize actually how much of it had been done here on our computers by our guys with our patient data. So with that, I'm done. Thank you.